midrasha asyon me'achos isha. We'll say the whole notion that when one wife is pater from yibum, or patura from yibum, she exempts all of the co-wives. And furthermore, again, even the co-wives, the tsaros, that whole notion, that whole concept is learned out from a drasha. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Nihi d'le'inyan yibum asyon midrasha, eker isuraihu behedjaksiv. It's true. I'll say when it comes to the concept of the Mishnah, that once a particular woman is patura from yibum, that her patur also exempts her co-wife and what we'll call the co-wives, the tsaros, all of that is learned out from a drasha, which we'll discuss. But here's what's interesting. But all of these other erva cases, the erva itself, right, the idea that the particular women listed in the Mishnah ultimately, again, are an erva, therefore prohibited to this man, that's written explicitly in the Torah. Here's what's fascinating. Bito ikar isura midrasha. See, Rabbi said, listen to this. The idea of bito, of one's daughter, being an erva, that's not explicit. Rabbi said, remember again, let's go back to the Mishnah for just a moment. Do you remember how we explained the case of bito? Bito is a case of a daughter out of wedlock. And by the way, the real case of daughter out of wedlock is bas anususo, is when a man violates a woman and then they have a daughter together. They have a daughter as a result of that act. And let's say we're going to see something fascinating, which is the Torah needs a particular drasha in order to tell me that essentially the daughter of that act is considered to be the daughter of the perpetrator. In other words, there's a havamina that since ultimately, again, this child is the result of such a violent act, that perhaps, again, she shouldn't be considered his daughter. Kamash malon, she is. That's the case of Bito. That's why Rashi goes out of his way to say the case of Bito is dafka daughter out of wedlock, and the case of daughter out of wedlock, again, is bas anasuso. So says the Gemara, listen to this, Bito ikar isura midrasha. Look at Rashi for just a moment. We're gonna take our time with the Rashi here also. Ikar isurahu she'osha mishum erva b'chol makom behedja ksiv behu. Aval bito me anasuso da'iri baba masnisin ikar isura midrasha asya. So I will say, how do we know that there is an isur erva between a man and the product of his act of rape? Right? How do we know that? To which the Gemara says, ksiv bito damarava. Amrli Rav Yitzchak Paradimi Asya Heina Asya Zima. I will say it is actually again a twofold gzeira shava of Heina Zima. Again, the psukim I will say most of us have it on the side of the Gemara. Rashi goes ahead and Rashi points out over here. We'll just look at Rashi quickly. Asya heina. We're actually just going to go ahead and just do the first line of each Rashi. Asya heina li isura. So we'll say ultimately again, heina creates the isur. That's the gzeir shava, and zima creates the punishment of sreifa. So therefore, we'll say just let's keep our eye on the ball over here. We have a very simple task in front of us, which is a simple task in a complicated Mishnah. Which is now that we learned the Mishnah, we went through all of the cases. We're just trying to figure out the order. Why did the Mishnah employ the particular order of the 15 women? That's all we're trying to figure out over here. To which the Sinai say, and specifically, we're starting with the first case, Bito. Why do we start with the case? And now we're understanding what's the case of Bito? What's the first case in the Mishnah? Sinai say, so now everything is coming together a little bit. Who's the daughter? Who's the daughter in question? The daughter in question is not simply what we'll call. I want to keep to the same names I was using yesterday. Somebody did give me this feedback, not to. When I say feedback, I mean criticism. So not to switch names in the middle of the case. So good. So referencing back actually to the sheet we used yesterday at just the first table. Right, we were talking about that the case of Bito, right? The case of Bito was that Reuven was married to two wives, right? Rachel and Leah. And remember again, the case of Bito was that Rachel was Shimon's daughter. I will say it turns out that the case of Bito, the way that the Gemara is setting it up over here, and that Rashi already alluded to in the Mishnah, was that Rachel was Shimon's daughter because Shimon violated her mother. Right? So Shimon violated her mother. That's the case of Bito. So I will say that whole case, leaving aside Yibum, the idea that Rachel is really Shimon's daughter, even though their relationship is through an act of rape, right? Even though the result, so that itself requires a drasha. That's not the typical case of daughter. That's not the typical case of bito. That itself requires a drasha. So because that Isser Erva itself, before we get to Yibum, requires a drasha, so therefore again, and if we go with the idea that which requires a drasha to learn it out is more chaviv, so to speak, in the eyes of Chazal, is the reason why they put the case of bito first. That's where we're holding with this. Let's go a little bit weiter. Says the Gemara, Hashta da Amrit Komil, da Asim Drasha Chaviv. So now that you're telling me, okay, I got it. Now I understand why the case of bito is first. And now that you're telling me anything that's learned out from a drasha, ultimately again is more chaviv, is more dear to Chazal. Listnei la'achos isha lebasof. So say, now watch this. This is so fascinating. See, if you're going to tell me that the reason why bito is first, is because it's learned from a drasha. I will say, now, by the way, let's be clear. Which part of bito is learned from a drasha? Which part of bito? Right? The core isser. Forget about yibum for just a moment. The idea that bas anasuso, the daughter of a woman from, right, the daughter of one's daughter from an act of violation, right? Ultimately, that's a man's daughter and that's an erva. That concept is learned out from a drasha. Then, of course, we applied in our Mishnah to a yibum context. So now that I understand that case is first because it's learned out from a drasha, so we'll say using then the style of the Mishnah, which case should go last? Right? We're not going to use the word simplest. Which word should we use? Explicit. So therefore, again, the case that's most spelled out biblically should go last. Because again, we're assuming we love drashas. Everyone loves drashas, right? So we're starting with the item that is the greatest drasha, kind of working, we assume we're working our way down from there. Therefore, the last thing mentioned in the Mishnah, the last of the 15 cases, should be the case that's most explicit. Now we'll say, what's the case when it comes to Yibum that's most explicit? To which the Gemara says, Hashta da Armet Komel Sadasim Midrash Chavibalei, Listni la'achos isha lebasof, the case of one's wife's sister ultimately should be the last. Why I say? Because apparently that is the most explicit case. How so? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Listni achos isha lebasof, tikulhu minei afinan le'inyan petur yibum lekaman. I will say, we're going to see the paradigmatic case, right? Remember, our Mishnah is talking about cases where you can't do yibum. Right? We'll say, what's the paradigmatic case where you can't do yibum? Paradigmatic case is where two brothers married two sisters. Right? So let's just use this for, let's just go back to the first table for a moment. So just imagine Reuven and Shimon married two sisters. So we'll say, now what happens? Reuven dies without children. Could Shimon do yibum? No. Why not? Because he can't be married to two sisters. Right? That's the case of achos isha. Right? That's the case ultimately again of your wife's sister. One's wife's sister is an erva. So that's actually that we're going to see. That's the biblically paradigmatic case. So then bipashtos, and that's explicit in the Torah. Bipashtos, that case should be last in the Mishnah. Yet it's not last in the Mishnah. So how do we explain the order? So I'll say, here we go. So he says the Gemara. Aidi da'ayri be'isr ach v'sa tana achos isha. No, because the way the Mishnah worked is that since halacha l'maisa, we were talking about cases of siblings, we put the case of achos isha as well. So I will say, essentially you're going to see what the Gemara is saying is like this. We're going to provide a reason for why we put the first case first, but then what ends up happening is we're kind of going to break up the cases into groups. So there's a sibling group. Right? There's a sibling group, right? A number of these cases fit into siblings. So therefore, again, achos isha, although it is the most quote-unquote explicit case, because it is biblically explicit, we're going to include it in the sibling group. So watch this. So it says the Gemara, v'listniye l'hai bava lebasof. So why not put the sibling group at the end of the Mishnah? Put the sibling group at the end of the Mishnah. So just you could see the way this is happening over here. Well, actually, we'll go back to Mishnah in just a moment. Ella Tana Kurvi Nakit. Rabbi say this is incredible. It really is. You have to admit, even Gemaras like this, they're just so fascinating. Because Rabbi say, what does it tell you? See, I'll tell you what you take from a Gemara like this. Rabbi say, do you see how much thought goes into a Mishnah? Come on, let's be honest. When we saw this Mishnah, it just looks like an. I don't want to use the word information dump because I don't like the word dump. But what does it feel like? An unloading of information, right? Just feels like an unloading of information. When you look at it, you don't assume necessarily that there's a rhyme or reason how the 15 cases are spelled out. You just say, come on, just give me the cases. He'll say, isn't it an incredible thing how Chazal model for us? You have to be thoughtful. You have to be a thoughtful person. You have to be a thoughtful person in the way you talk. You have to be a thoughtful person in the way you convey information. You have to be a thoughtful person in the way that you live. And every single part of your life should have thought behind it. There should be nothing that I do in life that is random. There should be nothing that I do in life that just happens. Everything should be thought out. Everything should be premeditated. Everything should be planned. And everything should be thoughtful. And that's what it's going to point out, because you think to yourself, why are we spending all this? Do I care how the 15 cases are listed? I'm just so happy if I can understand what is going on, right? That's an accomplishment. It doesn't matter to me. Let's be honest, it doesn't matter to me what the order, maybe it doesn't matter to us, but it matters to Chazal. Because Chazal, again, remember, through Gemara, through everything we learn, model for us how to live successful lives. And successful living requires thought. Successful living requires seder. Successful living requires premeditation. And successful living requires a proper framework. That's what Chazal are teaching us. See, here we go, Bo say. Here's the order to the Mishnah. Ella, Tana Korvi Nakit. So Bo say, listen to how the Mishnah is structured. The Mishnah is structured by degree of relatives. In other words, we start with closer relatives, and then we kind of work our way out from there. So therefore, I'll say, now it makes sense. Tana Bito. Now, I want to point out. So therefore, who do we start with? Right? Who do we start? Who's the closest? What's the closest case? Child, daughter. Now, I will say, now again, this does not negate what the Gemara said before. In other words, we want to start with Bito, because the case of Bito, remember again, is Bas on a Suso, and we like that case. You understand what I mean? In other words, the Gemara likes that case, the Mishnah likes that case, because again, it's learned that from a drasha. So that's not negating what we said before. But now the Gemara is also saying, by the way, we start with the closest relatives and we work our way out. Therefore, I'm saying, let's go through the cases. Tana, Bito, daughter, Bas Bito, granddaughter from my daughter, Bas Bino, daughter from my son, Dikrove Atzmo. Now I will say, those are close relatives to the man himself, what we'll call to the Yavam. Who said this to me last night at the Siyum, that they look at these cases through the vantage point of the Yavam? Somebody said that to me. Maybe it was, who was it? Yaakov? Okay, Yaakov says, right? Which is interesting. Again, you'll see Yaakov after the share. I was thinking about that afterwards a little bit. It might actually be an easier way to think about these cases, but okay, good. So I say any event. But here, the Mishnah is clearly doing that. We're looking at this through the perspective of the Yavam, right? So when we look at the Yavam is the brother who is going to do Yibum, what we call the surviving brother. So we look at, okay, who are his closest relatives? So let's start. Daughter, granddaughter from daughter, granddaughter from son. Okay, so those are his close relatives in this Yibum situation. Now, watch this. Va'aidi detana shlosha doros lemata didei. So remember, those three represent 3 generations downward, right? Downward. Daughter, granddaughter. Okay, now once we mentioned 3 generations for the Yavam, Tana nami shlosha doros lemata dida. Now, I'll say, what do? We go ahead and then we mention what? 3 generations down, Dida. Who's Dida, Bosai? Dida is for his wife, for the Yavam's wife, the surviving brother's wife. Because remember again, that's the second set of cases where the widow is a relative of the Yavam's wife. So we go ahead and we do 3 cases down for her. Who are the 3 cases down for her? So we'll say, so again, if you follow along in the Mishnah, we have Bito, Bas Bino, then Bas Ishto, Bas Bina, Bas Bita. Then we have the daughter of his wife, the daughter of her son, the daughter of her daughter. So we kind of mimic, first 3 are his closest relatives, generationally down. Next three cases are her, meaning his wife's, close relatives 3 generations down. Now watch this. So va'idi detana shlosha doros lamata dida. Now once we went ahead and we spoke about her 3 closest generations down, tana shlosha doros lamala dida. Then what do? We go ahead and we list the 3 closest generations to her, but the generations before her. Because we'll say, what comes next in the Mishnah? Chamoso, his mother-in-law. Aim Chamoso, his mother's mother. The mother of his mother-in-law. Ve'im Chamav, and the mother of his father-in-law. Those are still all relatives on his wife's side, but as opposed to the first 3, which were generations below her, these are generations above her. Right? And I will say now after that, so we'll say it's also an interesting style. We start with 3 generations below him, right? Then we go to 3 generations below his wife. Once we start talking about the wife, we kind of remain on her, and we go ahead and we go 3 generations above. Fascinating. It's fascinating to the style. So the Gemara says, then what happens? What's the next couple of cases? The Tana, then I will say now after that, we go ahead and we transition to sisters, right? After that, Vitana, Achoso, sister, Achos, Imo, the sister of his mother, Dikrove Atzmo. Ultimately, again, then we once again transition back to the man to speak about, again, his close relatives. Va'aidi da'airi be'isr achava. Now, once we get into the cohort, we'll call it, of siblings, Tana, Achos, Ishto. Once we're in the sibling cohort, then what? Then we speak about Achos Ishto. Now, I remember again, we speak about Achos Ishto, even though what? Right? Even though, remember, that's the biblically explicit case. Right? Even though that's the most obvious case, because the Torah speaks about it. But again, once we get into cohorts, and once we're looking at groupings, we include Achos Ishto in the sibling cohort. Ubedinhu dilakadme lekalaso mikame eshes achiv shelo haya ba'olamo jelo mishum korvahu di isura. Now the truth is, in this order, it would have made more sense to include the case of daughter-in-law. Now, I remember again, the case of daughter-in-law was a man has a son. His son is married, right? His son passes away, and the girl, right, the daughter-in-law, the widowed daughter-in-law, marries her uncle, right, her father-in-law's brother. That's the case of kalaso. So obviously now, when the second husband dies, the daughter-in-law falls to yibum to her father-in-law. That's the case of kalaso. In reality, we should have gone ahead and put the case of kalaso ultimately again before Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya Ba'olama. Remember that case? That's the case of where a brother is born, right? Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven dies, but Levi's not born until after Reuven's death. So we're going to see in that type of situation, Levi never does yibum. There's no yibum scenario where the brothers are not alive at the same time. So in reality, again, it's actually a really interesting case. We're going to get into that. So the Gemara says, and in reality, that really the case of daughter-in-law should have come before the case of the brother who was not living at the same time as his now deceased brother. I know that it doesn't make sense when you translate it, but you understand the case, right? Brothers who were not living at the same time. Why? Why should kalaso have come first? The mishum korvahu dasira, because I will say the case of kalaso, of daughter-in-law, is a case of kurva, is a case of a relative, right? Remember again, a son's wife is an erva, so that should have come first. Ela aidi da'airi be'isr achva. But once halacha l'maisa, we're speaking about situations of siblings. Tana eishes achav shelo haya ba'olamo v'hadar tana kalaso. We included the case of the brother who was born after the death of his brother, right? We put that case before the case of daughter-in-law. I will say here what we're struggling with is because the case of kalaso, daughter-in-law, is a real erva case. Right? That's a case of someone who's related to me. So Allah said that should have come first. But no, once we were talking about siblings, we ended off the sibling cohort, and then we put in kala. So I will say, Mazel Tov, we just finished our first sugya in Mesachas Yevamos, and if I dare say, it was exceptional. Right? I will say, absolutely incredible. What a fascinating sugya. I will say, but again, seriously, That's all. We just got the structure of the Mishnah. So now we see again, we're starting with Bito. Whether we're starting with Bito because we like it, because it comes from a drasha, and ultimately Chazal like us to learn Torah that we have to struggle for, and that doesn't just get delivered to our doorstep. We have to exert ourselves a little bit. That's number one. Or second possibility, which again, they're not mutually exclusive, is we start kind of with the cases that are closest to the Yavam, and then work our way out. 3 for him, 3 for her, generations down, generations up, and we build out from there. But the entire Mishnah has such a Moser Haskell that sometimes in life, Rabbi say, we see things, and when we look at it, we assume it's random and doesn't make sense, has no seder. But that's only because we don't understand it. And what an important metaphor for life, because sometimes the Kadosh Baruch Hu does things in his world, and we look at it and we say, wow, that is so random, doesn't make any sense. That's because we haven't learned the sugya. The Rebbe Shalom has a lot of sugyas in life, a lot of sugyas. Some of them we understand, many of them we don't. But you always have to operate with the understanding that there's always a logic to the sugya, right? Sometimes Kadosh Baruch Hu gives us a window. Sometimes he invites us to learn the sugya with him, and the circumstances of life begin to make sense. And sometimes the sugya is just beyond human comprehension. But even if I don't understand it, I must always believe that there is always a sugya. There's always an explanation, even behind the seemingly most random events in life. Let's go weiter. Says about a great Gemara. My area, the Tani Peturos, Lesni Asuros. Great kasha. It keeps getting better. Both says, listen to this. So the Mishnah, remember, the way the Mishnah reads is Chameshes Nashim Potros Saros Sehen. So we'll say, it says 15 women, Potros. Potros literally means what? Exempt. Now both say, Here's the challenge with the lashon of potros, right? What's the challenge with lashon of potter? What does potter sound like? When you're potter from something, what does that tell you? Right? You don't have to, but if you want to, you can. Now we'll say that's not true. That's not true. Remember, these are araya situations. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. My area the tani potros, listening osros. What do you mean potros? It should be 15 women make a yibum situation. Oh, sir, this is not potter. Right? Ultimately, look at Rashi. Rashi says, my time, it's in the intermediate wide lines. My area diktani potros, demashma peturos, hein, vi by miabim. It makes it sound like you're potter. But if you want to do yibum, okay, go ahead. No. This is usher. To which the Gemara says, listen to this. Itana osros, hava amina asr liyabim, aval michlatz chalza. But here's what's fascinating. We're going to get into this. There are cases where yibum is aser, but chalitza is required. Yibum is aser, chalitza is required. The truth is, I will say, we actually saw this a little bit in the Mishnah. We saw examples of this, right? So the Gemara says something amazing. Had it said, chamesh esrei nashim potros tsaros sehen. How did it say osros? We might have thought that osros means aser in yibum, but still an obligation to perform chalitza. The Gemara says, kamash malon, not kamash malon. Again, potros, the way the Gemara is understanding potros is kind of like you're exempted. But exempted is maybe the wrong word. Maybe what potros means in this case is you are removed from the framework of yibum. You don't have a seat at the yibum table, which means there's no yibum and what? No chalitza as well. To which the Gemara says, v'lisnei asura lachlos. So why don't you just say asura lachlos? In other words, why don't you just say that ultimately, again, it's asur for them to do yibum, right? And it's asur for them to do chalitza. In other words, why not just say it? To which the Gemara says, my ka'avid. The truth is, it's not true. We'll say, if somebody decides to do chalitza, could they do chalitza? No. We'll say, we're going to see, if you want to walk around doing chalitza all day, right? I mean, you definitely should get a different hobby, but lemaisa, it's fine. I guess you could take shoes off people's feet. And we'll discuss exactly what the process of chalitza is. But the truth is, if a person decides to do chalitza, it's weird. But lemaisa, you can't say it's usr. So the Gemara says, alamalo. So the Gemara says, im ata omer choletzes. That's not true. That's not true, actually, the Gemara says. Even though technically speaking, there's no isser, and I'll say we're going to get into the technicalities of how all of these things work. Even though there's no isser per se in the performance of chalitza, we don't let people perform chalitza. Just well, why not? Because Rabbi say everyone knows that Yibum and chalitza are sister concepts. And so if you allow people to walk around doing chalitza, what's going to happen? They're going to assume that what? That Yibum is mutros. That's very dangerous. If you allow for chalitza, if you think, oh, no big deal that people do chalitza, that's absolutely unequivocally false. Because where there is chalitza, people automatically assume that there's also the possibility for Yibum. To which the Gemara says, to which the Gemara says, Kevon de b'mako mitzvahu da'asira tzara v'shlo b'mako mitzvah sharia mishum hachi tani potros. So I will say this is actually very interesting. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Kevon de b'mako mitzvah yibum hu da'asira tzaras habas ukid mefarish umas nisin dechishem miftera hakasu mizekas yibum kaimalei be'eshes ach sheyesh lo banim. Just read one more Rashi. Shelo b'mako mitzvah sharia kigo nochri shena'aset chasna lo. I'm sorry. Kigo nochri shena'aset chasna. Let's take a step back. Let's translate the words, then we'll go back into Rashi. Rashi says, Kevon de b'mako mitzvah hu da'asira tzara. Let's just take the case of Bito again. Okay, go back to your table just for one moment. Let's just reference the case so we're all clear what we're talking about. Table A, right? Remember again, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven's married to two wives, Rachel and Leah, and Rachel is Shimon's daughter, right? So remember again, what's the first case in the Mishnah? Bito. Reuven dies. Two women, Rachel and Leah, fall to Shimon. Could Shimon do Yibum? No, why not? Rachel is his daughter. Now, what else happens? Because Rachel is his daughter, what happens to Leah? That she's the tzara, she's the co-wife, therefore she's exempt from him as well. So we'll say, now listen to this. The Gemara says, this is so fascinating. If the Mishnah would have used the lashon of osros, right, of asira, of aser, you would have thought that perhaps, what does aser mean? I'm always aser to my daughter's co-wife, even in a non-yibum situation. Now we'll say, what's an example of a non-yibum situation? Take a look at Rashi. Look at the Rashi. When it's shelo b'mako mitzvah, this is an interesting case. Kigon nochri shena'aseh chasno. Now we'll say, now it literally means, let's say I have nochri as a son-in-law. Now here, nochri doesn't mean a guy. Right? It doesn't mean a non-Jew. Nochri just means what? Someone who's not related to me. Right? So let's say I have a nachri. It could be many people think of their son-in-law as a nachri, right? But lamaisa, right? So what happens? So now someone totally unrelated to me marries my daughter, right? So we'll say, now what happens? Let's say that guy. We'll call him Yehuda, right? So Yehuda ultimately again is married to my daughter, and Yehuda has another wife. Yehuda dies. We'll say, so am I allowed to marry Yehuda's other widow, the one who's not my daughter? Yes. Why? Because Rabbi say, remember, that's not a Yibum situation. I have nothing to do with Yehuda. I mean, I have to do with him. He was my son-in-law. But Lamaisa, when he dies, so again, obviously my daughter is my daughter, but Lamaisa, the other woman who he was married to, was the co-wife of my daughter. But that co-wife, see, Rabbi say, here's what the Gemara's Chiddush is. Being the co-wife of an erva only precludes a man from marrying the co-wife when in a yibum situation. But where there is no, what we call zekas yibum, where there is no yibum connection, the co-wife of an erva is not supposed to say, isn't that fascinating? Absolutely fascinating. So therefore, I'm going to say, here's what's amazing. So the Mishnah says, we are nervous to use the lashon of osros. So had the Mishnah said, Chamesh Esrei Nashim, Osros Sarosehen, I would have thought that even in a non-Yibum situation, the co-wife of someone who is an erva to me is always aser. But in fact, Kamashlan, that's not the case. The only time that co-wife of an erva poses a problem is in Yibum scenarios. We'll say, isn't that exceptional? So let's read that in the Gemara now. So the Gemara is like this. So here's the lashon. Kevan de b'makom mitzvahu de'asira tzara. It's only b'makom mitzvah that the co-wife of an erva is aser. We'll say, what's the makom mitzvah? Yibum. Oh, it's only in Yibum that the co-wife of an erva becomes aser. V'shelo b'makom mitzvah sharia. Rabbi say where there is no mitzvah. In other words, what does it mean shelo b'makom mitzvah? where the man who died is not my brother. Right, so there's no yibum situation. No yibum situation. Sa'alocha l'maisa, in that type of situation, the co-wife of an erva is mutter. Shlo b'makom mitzvah sharia mishum hachi tani pturos. Therefore, again, the Mishnah wants to use lashon of pturos because they're both saying, what does pturos sound like? Ptur is dafka related to a mitzvah scenario. So it makes sense that it links the concept of the disqualification of the co-wife of an erva to a makom mitzvah to yibum, but it also tells me, kind of implicitly, that shalom b'makom mitzvah, in a non-yibum scenario, the co-wife of an erva will be permitted. Incredible. Furthermore, fine. So now I get it. Now I know why the Mishnah uses lashon of pturos or potros and not asuros. Furthermore, we'll say, why does the Mishnah have to say that these 15 women exempt their co-wives and their co-wives, min hayibum, min chalitza min hayibum? Why do you have to say from chalitza and yibum, right? Why can't you just go ahead and say, listen, min hayibum lichudei? Just say from yibum. Just say from yibum. To which the Gemara says, itana min hayibum hava amina michlatz chalza yivume lo miyavma. I say, because once again, I would have thought that if it would have just said yibum, that maybe again what that means is that halacha lamaisi can't do yibum in these cases, but what? But chalitza is mandated. Kamash malon, and here, underline these lines, because this is going to be an operating principle for us. Kala ola liyibum, ola lechalitza, v'chal she'ena ola liyibum, ena ola lechalitza. There, we'll say the Mishnah teaches us a very important principle. It is only when you are eligible for yibum that you are eligible for chalitza, but if you are not eligible for yibum, you are not eligible for a chalitza. And I will say that concept is true in every situation except when it's not, right? So again, what we're going to see, we'll say like every rule, right? There's no such thing as a rule aside from Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? There's no rule, right, that doesn't have exceptions, right? Every Zachar Sam Shabbos Lekadsho is a rule. Does it have an exception? Yeah, pikuach nefesh. Right? There are, of course, every. So we'll say. So again, it's okay for Chazal to articulate a rule, and that sounds like it has no, but it does, right? But in general, the principle is, like we just said before, yibum and chalitza are two sides of the same coin. V'listim and yibum and chalitza. And I both say this is fascinating. Okay, so now I got it, right? So let's work our way through. So now I understand the order of the 15 women. I also understand why it says potros and it doesn't say asuros. I also understand why it has to say yibum and chalitza, because that teaches me two sides of the same coin. What I don't understand is the order. I will say, what does the Mishnah say? These 15 women exempt themselves, or their co-wives and their co-wives are all exempt. Mina chalitza mina yibum. Why do you put chalitza before yibum? Right? Shouldn't it be min hayibum or mina chalitza? This is fascinating. Inami mina chalitza lechuda. Or what you could also say, by the way, what also seems to come out over here is just exempt them from chalitza. Because it would sound like if you're going ahead and exempting someone from chalitza, you certainly what? There's no yibum either. Okay. To which the Gemara supposed to say, this is fascinating. Abba Sholhi. The truth is, the Mishnah is reflective of the view of Abba Shol. Listen to this. Da'amar, mitzvahs chalitza kodemes la mitzvahs yibum. Wow. And I will say, we are going to get into this. This is going to be a dramatic and fascinating sugya. Rashi quotes it over here, Lamites. On the base, we have a little bit of time till we get to it. Abba Shol is of the opinion that we always discourage yibum and always encourage chalitza. Now, I will say, now what's going to be the reason for that? Abba Shol has a fascinating approach to yibum. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over a second to last line, Rashi says, Abba Shol he, beparak hacholitz, Abba Shol omer hakones yevimto l'shem noi, or l'shem ishos, kilu pogea be'erva. V'karov be'enai, lios havlad mamzer. So I will say, Abba Shol says something dramatic. Abba Shol says, yibum is only permitted if the marriage is purely and wholly for the sake of establishing a family line for the deceased brother. If the surviving brother marries the widow because he finds her attractive, because he finds her beautiful, because he likes her personality, he's attracted to her midos, whatever it is, something other than a pure intent to establish a line for his brother, Abba Shol says, it's erva, it's arayas. And Abba Shol says, I think if a man goes through with that union and has a child, that kid might be a mamzer. The kid might be a mamzer. So I will say, so now it makes sense. Like, All right, once that's the threshold for Yibum, very few takers for that, right? In other words, we'll say that is. So Abba Shal says, you know what? I'm going to recommend chalitza for you, right? So Abba Shal says chalitza. So we'll say Tosas has this idea also. Tosar again. We'll leave Tosar a different time. And we'll say, therefore, again, we go ahead and therefore the Mishnah reflects the view of Abba Shal. That's why again chalitza is mentioned first, right? So we'll say. So you really, by the way, what you begin to see is. There is a lot of nuanced information getting packed into this Mishnah, almost setting the stage for us for so many things that are to follow. Good. So we'll say, so now we know the Mishnah. Not all of it yet. Watch this. Minyan d'reish l'mi'utei mai, or minyan d'seif l'mi'utei mai. We'll say, there, interestingly enough, whenever you see, we know this through our journeys in Shas, right, through Shas, which is whenever a Mishnah highlights a number is always a number includes what's stated, but also what? Implicitly excludes something else. So when you say there are 15 women who are themselves exempted, co-wives exempted, co-wives of co-wives exempted, all of these people are exempted, by definition, you're excluding someone else from that list. So I'll say the Mishnah just points out, the Gemara just points out over here that the number is mentioned twice. In the beginning of the Mishnah, the number 15 is mentioned. At the end of the Mishnah, it says another line, Hare Elu Potros. Elu again is another, restating the number. So I'll say, what is the number coming to exclude? Which, I mean, the fact that you're telling me there are 15 indicates to me that there are others who didn't, quote unquote, make the Mishnaic cut. Who are they? Lemi'utei mai. We'll say Amid Beis. Really some fascinating cases. Lemi'utei d'Rav u'Ravasi. We'll say comes to exclude the cases of Rav and Ravasi. What are the cases? Here we go. L'Rav. So we'll say, well, look at Rashi. The Rav Ravasi, first Rashi Gimel Amid Beis. To Amarav tsaras sota asura. Shemzinsa ishto v'lo isha cheres u'meis below banim shtein potros. So we'll listen to this. Rav says, so we'll say, let's say again, Reuven, I'm just going to keep using from the first chart. Reuven is married to two women, Rachel and Leah. And what happens? Rachel is suspected of adultery. So there's a whole process when a woman is suspected of adultery. She goes to the Beis HaMikdash, there's the process of the sota. So let's say now Reuven dies before the sota process ever got a chance to get started. Right? So ultimately, again, she is what's called, she's a sota. She's a sota. So I will say, so now what happens? Rav says that halacha l'maisa, a sota, now when Reuven dies and Rachel's a sota, as a sota, she's going to be asura to Shimon, to the surviving brother. So Rav says, by the way, just like Rachel is a sota and therefore she's asur, so to Leah, her co-wife, is asur as well. That's Rav's position. Now clearly, again, our Mishnah did not accept that case. Again, we'll talk about it more. Our Mishnah did not accept that case. So according to Rav, the Mishnah comes to exclude that case. According to Rav Asi, interestingly enough, it comes to exclude the case of idleness. Remember again, same case. Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Let's say in this case, instead of Rachel being a sota, Rachel is an idleness, right? She is a woman who is incapable of having children, and ultimately, again, lacking certain signs of physical maturation as well. So ultimately, again, Ravasi says the same way that the idleness doesn't do yibum, right? Because we'll say obviously the whole point of yibum is to have children. If Rachel is an idleness, he doesn't do yibum. So again, Ravasi will say her co-wife Leah is also exempt from yibum. So we'll say these are the two additional cases of Rav and Ravasi that are not included in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says L'Rav Ravasi l'me'utei mai. So we'll say according to Rav and Ravasi, who hold that these cases should be included, which cases would they exclude from the Mishnah? So listen to this. It's really fascinating. So the Gemara says, Isvir lehu dahadadi. So we'll say, if, assuming that Rav and Ravasi both agree to each other's cases, chad leme'utei tsaras mima'enes, v'chad leme'utei tsaras machzir grushaso. I will say this is fascinating. So assuming that Rav and Ravasi both agree to each other's cases, the Mishnah would come to exclude two very interesting cases, which is, one would exclude ultimately against Saras Mima Enes. So I'll say, take a look at Rashi. Saras Mima Enes, Hari Shahaya La'echav Yisoma Kitana, V'isha Acheres, Umeis Umina Kitana B'yavam. Also listen to this. We're going to see this is an interesting case. Back to Reuven. Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Rachel is a minor. Rachel is a minor, which means her brother or her mother married her off. Reuven dies. Rachel does miyun to Shimon. We're going to see this case where Rachel says, I don't want to marry you. She says, I don't want to marry you. So I will say, so we're going to see that there's an opinion that holds that once Rachel does miyun, ultimately the co-wife is precluded from yibum as well. So it could be that one is to exclude that case, and the other is machzir grushaso. They both say this is fascinating. Back to Reuven, right? Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Reuven divorced Rachel. Rachel went and married Zvulun, right? And then Abba say what happened? Rachel and Zvulun got divorced. Abba say the halacha is you're not allowed to remarry your wife if she married someone else in the interim, or you can't remarry your ex-wife if she married someone else in the interim. In other words, if a couple get divorced, right, and then they decide to reconcile, and the wife has not married anyone else in the interim, they could get back together. In this case, Rachel and Reuven got divorced. Rachel married Zvulun. She got divorced from Zvulun. Ultimately, Reuven illegally remarries her. And I will say, again, this is the type of illegal relationship. We're going to talk about this. This is the type of illegal relationship where it works. In other words, halacha l'maaseh, there are some illegal relationships where they're so illegal that if you try to affect kiddushin, it doesn't work. Example of that, right? Daughter, right? Bito. Man tries to marry his daughter. There's no such thing as kiddushin in that case. But let's say again, a guy wants to marry his wife who's been married, right? They got divorced. He wants to remarry his wife who had been married to someone else in the interim. Halacha l'maaseh, it's usher, but it works. So I will say, so listen to this. In that case now, so Reuven remarries Rachel. Now what happens? Reuven dies. Rachel and Leah fall to Shimon. So again, there's an opinion that says that because Rachel was part of an illegal marriage to Reuven, she's precluded from Yibum, and ultimately again precludes her co-wife as well. So I will say, so therefore that would be another case that was excluded from the Mishnah. Vilo svir lahu hadadadi, and ultimately again, if Rav and Ravasi do not agree to each other's cases, then chadal lemiute dechavre v'chadal lemiute otzaras mama and as otzaras machzer grushaso. Then I will say then one number, so to speak, would exclude the other one's case, and the other minion at the end of the Mishnah would exclude one of these other two aforementioned cases as well. Beautiful. So we'll say Ravasi listeninu, to which the Gemara says, so we'll say, according to Rav and Ravasi, why not go ahead and include these cases? So we'll say, Rav and Ravasi say that the two cases excluded by the Mishnah were the case ultimately again of Sota and ultimately and Eilinus. So according to Rav and Ravasi, why not include these cases in the Mishnah? To which the Gemara says something very interesting. Lefi she'ina b'tsaras tsara. Because at the end of the day, interestingly enough, these cases of Eilinus and Sota do not have the same implications by tsaras tsara, for the co-wife of the co-wife. So I will say, remember again, in order to be included in the Mishnah, you have to fit a model. What's the model? That the woman herself is an erva, right? And by definition would preclude her co-wife from doing yibum. And then even if that co-wife ends up in a yibum situation with another one of the brothers, that co-wife will answer any other subsequent co-wives. But apparently in the cases of Sota and the case of Eilinus, as much as they're aser, and they could potentially go ahead and aser their co-wives, they would not aser in the case of tsaras tsara. Okay, good. So we'll say let's drill down a little bit more into the Gemara now. So says the Gemara, Minhani Mili. So we'll say, so now we're really getting into it. So Minhani Mili, we'll say, look at Rashi, Minhani Mili, the erva v'tsarasa tsarasa the olam potra. So we'll say, how do we know this framework of the Mishnah? In other words, we'll say the notion that halacha l'maisa. So I know here, but there's a couple things we have to learn. Number one, that an erva can't do yibum, or better stated, that the surviving brother can't do yibum with an erva. Because also remember again, we need a limud like that, because remember, the whole notion of yibum is what? Is marrying an erva. Right? We'll say again, let's like the great chiddush of yibum is as follows: a brother's wife is aser. A brother's wife is aser, right? All brother's wife. So halacha l'maisa. So the notion that a man could marry his widowed sister-in-law is a chiddush. So first of all, where do we know that from? Number two, where do we know that by other ervas, the presence of an erva or an erva identity precludes yibum? How do I know that once the erva is precluded from yibum, her co-wife becomes precluded from Yibum? And how do I know that even when the co-wife enters into a different Yibum relationship, when that brother dies and everyone falls to the what we'll call the Erva brother, that everyone is precluded from Yibum? How do I know all of that? So here we go, Bose. Now we're going to delve into it. Minhani Mili. Here we go. The Tan Rabbanan, Isha alachos lo sikach litzrar legalos ervasa aleha bechayeha. So Bose, so the pasuk says as follows: the Isha elachosa lo sikrav litzra legalos ervasa aleha bechayeha. So let's just translate the pasuk. And a man, and a man, the Isha elachosa, right, and ultimately again a woman and her sister. A person should not come close to uncover their nakedness upon him bechayeha during the lifetime. So okay, so let's analyze this. So says the Gemara, Aleha ma Talmud lomar. So I'll say, what does Aleha mean? Now I'll say, so just to point out over here, this is the prohibition to marry a woman and her sister, right? Isha alachosa. So ultimately, again, I will say, so now what's the lashon of Aleha? Says the Gemara, ma Talmud lomar, lefi shene'emar, Yevamos yavo aleha. Oh, very interesting. I will say aleha is the same lashon we find by Yibum, right? The pasuk says Yevamos yavo aleha, which literally means the Yavam, the surviving brother who does Yibum, should have relations with his now new wife, his former sister-in-law. Shomea ani afilu ba'achas mikol arayos hamuras b'Torah. I might have thought that Yibum should take place even if the widow is any kind of erva to the surviving brother. To which the Gemara says, Both say ultimately again we make a gzir shava of aleha. Ultimately what? To teach us what? Ma lahalon b'makom mitzvah. Just like over there we're talking about the case of a mitzvah. Afkan b'makom mitzvah. So too over here we're talking about the mitzvah of Yibum. And what does the Torah say? Va'amarachmana lo sikach. And the Torah ultimately says you can't go ahead and take them. So both say, so now what the Gemara's understanding is like this. The pasuk that teaches me that I can't marry a one woman and her sister is also teaching me another halacha. There's two halachas embedded in this pasuk. Isha elachosa lo sikach litzrar. So I'll say, right, I can't go ahead. So now let's translate the pasuk a little bit more explicitly. I cannot take a woman and her sister litzrar. Rabbi say litzrar means what? How would you translate litzrar? As soros, as co-wives, right? I cannot go ahead and take those women as co-wives. Legalos ervasa, to uncover their nakedness. Aleha. Now I will say, now what does aleha teach me? I will say aleha creates a gzera shava between the isser of what we call achos ishto and yibum. And what does it teach me? That halacha l'maisa, as much as yibum is a mitzvah, but if the case of yibum, if the situation of yibum leads to achos isha, you can't do yibum. So Rabbi says, so just to illustrate that, Reuven and Shimon are brothers, and Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters. Reuven dies. Now again, Reuven's widow falls to Shimon and Yibum. So again, Shimon can't do Yibum. Why? Because Shimon's present wife is the sister of the Yevama. And the Torah implicitly teaches us that Allah Lamaisa Yibum in that type of erva situation is going to be us. So Rabbi say, this is what we meant before when we said that the case of Achos Ishto is the explicit case. See, I will say, just I want to say, the pasuk that we're referring to over here is a pasuk that just generally prohibits marrying a woman and her sister. That's the pasuk. The extra word aleha, which is the word that's also found in the Yibum context, creates a halachic bridge to Yibum to say, by the way, even in a Yibum situation, which normally allows a man to marry a woman who was previously an erva, will preclude you from doing so when that woman is your present wife's sister. Incredible. And the Torah says you can't take her. I only know that this applies to the widow who is also my sister's wife. How do I know that it also applies to the widow's co-wife? So Talmud Lomar litzrar. Abba say, listen to this. So therefore the Torah uses the lashon of litzrar. Now Rashi says, or litzrar means tsaros harbe. Tsaros harbe. He'll say it refers even to many other wives. Rashi says because you could have written that word in a shorter form. He could have said latsur. The fact that it uses an elongated form litzrar comes to include every other wife who is tethered to the widow. Right, so again, remember, we're talking about a very specific case over here, where Reuven dies, Reuven dies, he leaves behind two wives, Rachel and Leah, right, there's Shimon now wants to do Yibum. The problem is, Shimon is married to Rachel's sister, so the Torah tells us, you're not allowed to marry a woman and her sister, and that's true even in a Yibum situation. How do I know that the prohibition to do Yibum is going to spread to Leah as well, the co-wife? Litzrar. You can't have any type of marital bond with any, right? No type of yibum bond, even with someone else who halacha l'maisa was connected to the erva. Ve'enli ela tzarasa minayin. I only know that applies to the actual co-wife. How do I know the case of the co-wife's co-wife? Right, we'll say, remember, that was, just to refresh your memory, that was in table A, the last case, right? That's where ultimately, again, Leah, the non-erva wife, ends up going ahead and marrying Levi. The third brother, Levi dies. Levi also had another wife, Miriam. Miriam now falls to Shimon, the first brother, right, who couldn't do Yibum because he was related to one of the wives. Halacha l'mais, again, that's the case of Tzara, that even Miriam can't go ahead and marry Shimon and Yibum. So how do I know this? To which the Gemara says, Tamalomar, litzror velo latzor. I will say once again, it's fascinating. The entire drasha is really focused on the concept of litzror. Since the Torah writes this word longhand, right, it comes to include anyone and everyone who has any level of marital bond to this original erva situation. Incredible. I will say now, so remember, all this teaches me is that I can't do Yibum when? In a case of my wife's sister. How do I know that it applies to every single other erva? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Amrit, let's go. So I will say, what's unique about achos ishto? In a case of one's wife's sister. I will say, what's the halacha? She's an erva, number one. And ultimately, again, if you intentionally have relations with her, it's kares. Unintentionally, shogeg, right? Shogeg situation. I don't know, right? Ashigasa, right? Chatos, right? Chatos. That carries with it again a chatos penalty, right? Va'asur liyavam. So we're creating a paradigm. What's unique about achos ishta? It satisfies these three criteria. Number one, erva. Number two, intentional kares. Unintentional chatos. Af koshi erva v'chayavan azadona kares v'ashigagasa chatos asura liyavam. So we'll say, so again, pretty much, once you create the framework, anyone who fits into that framework ultimately, again, is going to fall into this halacha. So if you're erva, intentionality, kares, unintentional, chatos, is also to do yibum. Ve'enli elahain, that only teaches me the erva herself. Tsarosein minayin. How do I know about say that this halacha will apply to all of the tsaros of anyone who's an erva? Amrit ma ochos ishtam yuchadesh shi erva v'chayav and alzadona kares al shigagasa chatos asur liyavam v'tsaras asura. Both say it's the same thing. Achos ishta creates the paradigm. She's an erva. Intentionality is kares. Unintentionality ultimately is a chatas, and she precludes her tsaros. Af koshi erva v'chayavan azadona kares v'ashigagasa chatos v'asura liyavam sarasa asura. Ultimately, and I will say, anyone who fits the bill, right? Anyone ultimately, again, who fits the paradigm of erva, kares, chatos, is herself asur and makes her tsaros asura. Mikan amru, based on this, Chazal said, Mikan amru chachamim chameshes nashim potros tsarosein v'tsaros tsarosein min hachalitza u'min hayibum ad sof ha'olam. And I will say, so now we see it. So everything comes from achos isha. Achos isha, the case of a wife's sister, is the paradigmatic case of erva, but also creates the paradigm ultimately again for yibum, and teaches us again that the erva is exempted, the tzara of the erva is exempted, and tsaros of the erva is exempted. I will say, shkoyach, stop over here for today. All right, Chevron, everyone have a great day. Very good to see you. Nothing good to see you. Yeah, I get a different view of everyone on Zoom now. We use it from the laptop. Shkaya for everyone. Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Akiva. Just so you're here.